Nobody could explain why the train traveled with its windows covered. Even the American soldiers guarding it knew only one rule: no names, no questions. Inside, the passengers sat in silence. Some had spent years designing aircraft engines. Others had built rockets that terrified Europe. One carried nothing except a worn leather notebook filled with equations. They were not ordinary prisoners of war. And before the journey ended, they would become some of the most valuable people on Earth. The war in Europe had barely ended when another race quietly began. It was not fought with tanks or bombers. It was fought with scientists. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany during the spring of 1945, they discovered laboratories hidden inside forests, abandoned mines, mountain tunnels, and underground factories. Many had been bombed only days earlier. Equipment lay scattered across concrete floors. Half-finished aircraft rested beneath collapsed roofs. Filing cabinets had been burned in haste, but not everything had disappeared. The most valuable discoveries were not machines. They were the people who had built them. Across Germany, hundreds of engineers, physicists, chemists, and technicians suddenly realized that the war was ending, and that whoever reached them first would determine the rest of their lives. Some tried to disappear. Some destroyed years of research. Others packed their documents and began walking west, hoping to surrender to American troops instead of the advancing Soviet army. They knew the difference could mean everything. One of those groups emerged from the Harz Mountains, carrying white cloth tied to wooden sticks. There were no weapons, only suitcases. Inside the cases were technical drawings, calculations, and notebooks that represented years of work on advanced rockets and guided weapons. An American intelligence officer later admitted that he first thought they were refugees. Then one engineer quietly introduced himself. Within minutes, armed guards surrounded the group, not because they were dangerous, but because they had suddenly become extremely important. The Americans had expected to capture soldiers. Instead, they found experts whose knowledge could shape the future. Teams from military intelligence quickly began interviewing them. Every conversation followed the same pattern. What had they worked on? Who else knew the project? Where were the remaining documents? Which factories had survived? Each answer created another question. Each notebook pointed toward another laboratory hidden somewhere inside defeated Germany. Meanwhile, time was running out. Soviet forces were searching for exactly the same people. Entire research centers were being emptied almost overnight. Scientists disappeared from one town only to reappear hundreds of kilometers away under military escort. Sometimes the Americans arrived first. Sometimes they arrived too late. The competition unfolded quietly, far from newspaper headlines. Few civilians even knew it existed. One discovery changed everything. Inside a partially abandoned testing center, American investigators recovered technical reports describing long-range rocket experiments far beyond anything they had expected to find. The documents were incomplete. Several pages had clearly been removed. Someone had taken the missing sections only days before. The obvious question followed immediately. Who had them? Finding those papers suddenly became as important as finding the scientists themselves. The search spread across occupied Germany. Military police checked roads. Counterintelligence officers questioned local officials. Engineers already in custody were shown photographs and asked to identify colleagues. Sometimes they refused. Sometimes they cooperated. Each interview revealed another name, another village, another hidden workshop. The puzzle slowly grew larger instead of smaller. One elderly machinist finally mentioned something unusual. A convoy had left the previous week, not carrying weapons, not carrying soldiers, only steel boxes sealed with wax and loaded under heavy guard. Nobody knew where they had gone, but everyone agreed on one detail. Whatever was inside those boxes mattered more than the factory itself. The Americans immediately changed their priorities. The scientists were important, but now they believed the real prize might still be moving somewhere across a defeated Germany. And they intended to find it before anyone else did. The steel boxes were found before the men who had packed them. Hidden beneath stacks of ordinary military supplies inside an abandoned rail depot, they looked completely unremarkable. No warning labels, no military markings, just heavy grey containers secured with thick locks. When American officers forced them open, the room fell silent. Inside were thousands of pages of engineering drawings, rocket guidance systems, fuel calculations, wind tunnel results, blueprints for engines unlike anything the Allies had seen before. The papers had survived the collapse of the Third Reich. Now another race was beginning. Within days, military trucks carried both the documents and their authors to temporary intelligence centers scattered across Western Germany. The scientists were separated immediately, not because they were under punishment, because every interview mattered. American officers quickly realized that no single engineer understood every project. One specialized in propulsion, another knew metallurgy, someone else designed control systems. Each held only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Only together did the picture become clear. The questioning often lasted for hours. Maps covered the walls, captured photographs lay across long wooden tables. One officer pointed toward a blurred aerial image. "What's here?" The engineer studied it for several seconds. "Not anymore," he finally answered. It was a testing bunker. The reply only created another mystery. If the bunker had existed, where had the equipment gone? Teams were dispatched almost immediately. Again and again they arrived at empty buildings. Machine foundations remained bolted into concrete floors. Electrical cables hung from ceilings. Fresh tire tracks disappeared into nearby forests. Someone had removed entire laboratories only days before. The Americans weren't chasing machines anymore. They were chasing time. Meanwhile, the scientists waited under heavy guard. The conditions surprised many of them. They had expected prison cells. Instead, they found simple military housing, regular meals, medical examinations, and endless interviews. Freedom was still impossible, but neither were they treated like ordinary prisoners. One physicist later admitted that this confused him more than hostility would have. Nobody explained what would happen next. Outside the compounds, rumors spread quickly. Some believed the scientists would soon stand trial. Others expected them to be sent home after questioning. A few whispered something even stranger. America wasn't planning to let them leave at all. No one knew whether that was true. Not even the guards. The interviews became increasingly technical. Civilian engineers from American universities began arriving alongside military officers. Blackboards filled with equations. Engine parts were placed on tables for comparison. Sometimes discussions continued late into the night. The atmosphere no longer resembled an interrogation. It looked more like a laboratory. One American specialist quietly admitted to a colleague They're answering questions we didn't even know how to ask. Back in Washington, reports piled higher every week. Some officials saw enormous opportunity. Others saw enormous risk. Many of these scientists had worked directly for Nazi Germany. Could they be trusted? Should they ever be allowed inside the United States? The debate became increasingly intense. Military leaders argued that the Soviet Union was searching for exactly the same experts. If America refused them, someone else would not. The decision could influence the balance of power for decades. Then the order finally arrived. It was short, confidential, and unlike anything most of the scientists had expected. A carefully selected group would leave Germany. Their destination would remain secret until the last possible moment. Even their escorts received only sealed instructions. Within hours, luggage was packed. Documents were inventoried one final time. The scientists boarded another train under armed guard. This time, however, the journey would not end somewhere in Europe. It would end across the Atlantic. And once they reached America, they would discover that they had not simply been rescued. They had been recruited into a mission whose true purpose was still hidden from them. The first thing they noticed was the heat. Not the soldiers, not the fences, the heat. After weeks of trains, guarded compounds, and military transports across Europe, the warm air that greeted them as they stepped onto American soil felt almost unreal. No one told them exactly where they were. Only later would they learn the name: Fort Bliss, Texas. And beyond it stretched miles of empty desert, far from newspapers, crowded cities, and curious eyes, exactly where the US Army wanted its newest secret to remain. The scientists expected another round of interrogations. Instead, they were handed schedules. Medical examinations came first, then security briefings. After that, something unexpected. Work, not forced labor. Scientific work. American officers escorted small groups into workshops already filled with drafting tables, machine tools, and captured German equipment shipped across the Atlantic. Many of the engines sitting inside those buildings were ones the scientists themselves had designed years earlier. Seeing them again thousands of miles from Germany felt almost impossible. The first meetings were cautious. American engineers stood on one side of the room, German specialists on the other. Both groups understood that they needed each other, but trust would take far longer. Every discussion began with technical questions. How stable was the fuel mixture? Why had one engine failed during testing? Could the rocket climb higher? Soon the blackboards filled with equations. Measurements covered entire walls. Language became less of a barrier than anyone expected. Mathematics required no translation. Outside the laboratories, however, life remained tightly controlled. The scientists could not simply leave. Military police monitored the facility. Mail was inspected. Travel required permission. Even conversations with visitors were carefully recorded. Some later described themselves as guests. Others quietly admitted they still felt like prisoners. The truth was somewhere in between. The American government faced a difficult balance. These men possessed knowledge, unlike almost anyone else in the world. At the same time, many had worked inside the German war machine. Background investigations continued for months. Military intelligence examined personnel files. Former colleagues were questioned. Documents captured in Germany were translated page by page. Sometimes new information delayed promotions. Sometimes it ended careers before they even began. Not everyone who arrived in America was allowed to remain. While those investigations continued, another development changed everything. The Soviet Union successfully recovered its own teams of German specialists from the Eastern Occupation Zone. American intelligence reports described entire research groups moving east under Soviet supervision. Suddenly, every week mattered. Washington no longer viewed the program as simply studying German technology. Now it was a competition. Whichever nation advanced faster could dominate the next generation of military science. The Second World War had ended. A different kind of conflict was quietly beginning. The work accelerated. Captured V-2 rockets were carefully rebuilt using surviving components. Each bolt was catalogued. Each fuel valve inspected. Launch crews practiced for weeks before every test. Many of the German engineers watched silently as American soldiers assembled machines they themselves had once built in Europe. Sometimes they corrected small mistakes. Sometimes they simply observed. Every successful launch produced another flood of measurements. Altitude, speed, engine pressure, flight stability. Every result became another lesson. One launch ended almost before it began. Seconds after ignition, the rocket veered off course. Emergency alarms echoed across the desert. The engine was destroyed. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then one German propulsion specialist quietly walked toward the remains. He picked up a twisted metal fragment, turned it over in his hands, and pointed to a tiny crack near one of the fuel lines. The floor was barely visible, yet it had been enough to destroy the entire launch. American engineers gathered around immediately. For the next 2 hours, no one talked about countries or uniforms, only engineering. By the end of the year, something remarkable had happened. Former enemies had begun solving problems together. Not because history had been forgotten, it hadn't, but because the race for knowledge had become larger than the war itself. Still, one question remained unanswered. Why was the US government investing so much effort into rockets that no longer needed to fight Germany? The answer was already taking shape thousands of miles away. And before long, it would transform not only military strategy, but humanity's path towards space itself. The rockets rising over the New Mexico desert were no longer weapons. They had become classrooms. Every launch answered one question and created 5 more. How high could a rocket fly before its instruments failed? How would metal behave beyond the atmosphere? Could a missile one day carry something besides explosives? The answers mattered for far more than military planning. Without realizing it, the engineers standing in the desert were helping to build the foundations of the space age. By the late 1940s, the work had expanded beyond captured technology. American engineers were no longer simply copying German designs. They were improving them. New materials replaced old ones. Engines became more reliable. Guidance systems grew increasingly accurate. The German specialists still contributed valuable experience, but the projects were becoming something entirely new, a combination of American industry and European engineering. It was exactly what military planners had hoped for. Not everyone approved. Even inside the United States, newspapers and government officials questioned whether former German scientists should be allowed to continue their work. Some had belonged to organizations connected with the Nazi regime. Others insisted they had only been engineers following orders. The debate never truly disappeared. It remains part of the historical discussion even today. The achievements were undeniable, so were the moral questions. history refused to offer simple answers. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to grow, rocket research became increasingly important. Long-range missiles were no longer theoretical. Both superpowers were racing to develop them first. Every successful engine test, every improvement in guidance, every technical breakthrough could shift the balance of power. The laboratories that had once seemed temporary suddenly became permanent. Budgets increased, new research centers appeared. Young American engineers entered the program, learning from men they had once expected to fight against. Then another goal slowly emerged, one far beyond war. Scientists began asking whether powerful rockets could carry scientific instruments into space. Could they measure cosmic radiation, photograph the upper atmosphere, perhaps even place an artificial satellite into orbit? Only a decade earlier, such ideas had sounded like science fiction. Now they appeared in official reports. The dream was becoming mathematics. Many of the German engineers spent years working quietly behind laboratory doors. Few Americans knew their names. Fewer still understood how much of the country's early rocket program depended on knowledge recovered during the final months of World War II. The public saw spectacular launches. The engineers saw thousands of failed calculations, burned engines, collapsed test stands, explosions that erased months of work in seconds. Progress rarely arrived through dramatic breakthroughs. It came one correction at a time. Then, in 1957, everything changed. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. For millions of Americans, it came as a shock. For the engineers working on rockets, it became proof that the race they had entered years earlier had never truly ended. The urgency returned overnight. Research accelerated, funding multiplied. Projects that had once moved slowly suddenly became national priorities. America intended to catch up, and then move ahead. Only a few years later, that effort led to the creation of NASA. Many of the engineers who had crossed the Atlantic in secrecy after the war found themselves working openly on rockets designed not for battle, but for exploration. The technology that had once been created to destroy cities was now helping humanity reach beyond Earth. History had taken an extraordinary turn. In July 1969, as millions of people around the world watched a television screen, human beings stepped onto the moon for the first time. That achievement belonged to thousands of engineers, technicians, factory workers, pilots, mathematicians, and scientists from many backgrounds. No single group made it possible, but among them were men whose journey had begun on a silent train, leaving a defeated Germany 24 years earlier. They could never have imagined where that journey would end. Their story remains one of the most complicated chapters of the 20th century. It is not a story of heroes, nor is it simply a story of villains. It is a story about knowledge, how it survives wars, crosses borders, and changes the future in ways nobody can fully predict. The rockets they once built for conflict eventually helped carry satellites into orbit, astronauts to the moon, and scientific missions deep into space. The war had ended. The choices made afterward shaped the world that followed. Sometimes the most important victory in history is not winning a battlefield. It is deciding what to do with the knowledge left behind.